right? I'm just going to share a few things about what type of relationship we should try and work on. And because that's what the month's about. Like if your month of Ramadan is being defined by anything else and not the Qur'an, then we've missed the point, because that's not how Allah's framed it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He frames Ramadan, He frames it through the Qur'an. But what we need to start doing is start moving towards a type of relationship that's wanted from us. Not the type of relationship that we want with the Qur'an, but the type of relationship that the Qur'an wants us to have with it. And the Qur'an's made that very clear, right? What type of relationship we should have. But so there needs to be a movement away from this kind of obsession with outward recitation, doing khatmat, like even hifz, for example. Like we know, how many hufaz do we have amongst the Sahaba? How many Sahaba memorized the entire Quran? Any ideas? Sorry? Very few. Yeah, you literally have under 20 Sahaba that memorized the entire Quran in the age of the Rasul ﷺ, and then some completely thereafter. So if we're talking about, say we're talking about 70,000 Sahaba who are close to the Rasul ﷺ, from amongst them, and the point again is not that these are blessed things, but the idea is that for the type of generation, for the age that we live in, and for the type of generation that the Ummah needs, like the type of human being that the Ummah needs in the coming ages, the type of relationship that we have with the Quran must switch. It needs to change in a big way, right? The obsession needs to move away from these random, arbitrary markers to where it was meant to be, right? And so the scholars, radiallahu anhum, they talk about four things. I'll mention four things. There's other things, but the scholars mention four things, right? First thing is Iman. Like the relationship with the Quran is defined by Iman. What does it mean to believe in the Quran? Right? And that becomes a discussion in itself. But the first thing the ulama mentioned in terms of your personal connection with the Book of Allah, the first thing is your connection in it by way of faith, by way of Iman inside the book, right? And what that essentially means is that the Quran becomes your defining lens for how you interact with life. Right? So in other words, when things happen in life, the events of life, the difficulties of life, whatever it is, whatever's happening inside your life, you look at it through the lens of the Quran. Any event that's happening, and what I mean by that is, as an example, right, if you want to look at this, and this is what was happening with the Sahaba. Like sometimes, if you look at the Quran, sometimes it feels like a very insensitive. If the Quran was a human being, sometimes it feels very insensitive. So I'll give you an example, right? So you just had Hudaybiyah, right? So you've had Hudaybiyah. You know what happened in Hudaybiyah? The Sahaba radiallahu anhum in Hudaybiyah, they get a bad deal with the companions. Sayyidina Umar ibn al-Khattab, we know the words that he says, right? He goes to Sayyidina Abu Bakr and he says, Alasna ala haqq. Like, are we not, is this not true? Alasna ala dinillah. Are we not upon, why are we taking a knock for being upon the truth? Sayyidina Umar is questioning, Sahaba asking questions. Like, so in all the outward sense, the Sahaba have been, they were in ihram. They were not allowed to enter Makkah al-Mukarramah, right? Think about Abu Jandal, just that one occasion where the Sahaba are stood there, they're being told to take their ihram off. The Rasul just signed a treaty, and a Muslim prisoner, one of their brothers, Abu Jandal, he's brought in shackles, he's chained up, and he walks right past the ranks of the Sahaba, and he begins to weep and beg the Prophet ﷺ for mercy. And the Rasul ﷺ, he turns to the Quraysh and he says, I'm going to take this one. And the Meccans said, you've signed the deal. The deal is that you don't take any prisoners of war, right? Like if you catch anyone, you return them. If we catch someone, we do not return them. That was the deal. And the Rasul signed it. And so Sayyidina Umar ibn al-Khattab, he says, Ya Rasulullah, will you let Abu Jandal walk in shackles in front of us? And the Prophet ﷺ turns away from him, right? He can't even respond to him. And so Sayyidina Umar then runs to Sayyidina Abu Bakr as-Siddiq and he says, what is this? Why are we taking a knock for being upon the truth? And so they get into this mode, and he's going to other Sahaba. And so imagine that moment, the complete despair, the state of defeat, right? Now imagine you've got trauma from that, right? Like imagine you've got trauma from Hudaybiyah. And you go to your shrink or your counselor or your psychotherapist or whoever you're going to go to, right? So, and you go to your psychotherapist and he says, you know what, I've got trauma from Hudaybiyah, right? Like if you imagine us being in Hudaybiyah, there'd be like permanent trauma, right? Anyway, so he said, I've got trauma from Hudaybiyah, and the therapist is like it's all right. That was a good day. And you're like, but why are you not validating me? What about my feelings? I feel traumatized. I need some validation here, right? If you sometimes the Quran is very insensitive, right? So they've just gone through all of Hudaybiyah, and there's all this trouble, and there's all this trauma, and Abu Jandal, and they used to call it Yawmu Abu Jandal. So now Umar ibn al-Khattab, his trauma was so strong, he would say, Ya Rasulullah, is this going to be like the day of Abu Jandal? Like every time after Hudaybiyah, he would refer to it as the day of Abu Jandal. Like the day we let Abu Jandal walk shackled because we couldn't take him, right? And so now what happens is the Qur'an comes down. So imagine the Qur'an's your therapist. The Qur'an's dealing with your post-Hudaybiyah trauma, right? What does the Qur'an say? Oh, Hudaybiyah, inna fatahna laka fathan mubina. That was like a major, clear victory. Hudaybiyah, we gave you a victory. Not even like a victory, we gave you conquest on that day. You were like an army that went in, trampled the enemy, and came back completely victorious, right? That's Hudaybiyah. It's not even like Fathan, it's Fathan Mubina. It's like we've given you a powerful, manifest Fatah, right? So if you're Sahaba and you're traumatized, you're thinking, what's going on here? Like, how is that a Fath Mubin? Or like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when He speaks about the genocide, about the women that used to be, the daughters that were buried alive by the Arabians. In Surah Al-Buruj, and Allah says in Surah Al-Buruj, He mentions all of these, about the difficulties of the people of the past nations, the trauma, talking about a genocide that went by, the believers were killed. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, ذَلِكَ هُوَ الْفَوْزُ الْكَبِيرُ, right? Surah Al-Buruj. ذَلِكَ هُوَ الْفَوْزُ الْكَبِيرُ. That is the supreme success, right? The Quran is completely, that's what's meant by Iman here. In other words, what the Quran was doing was, you're having an event in life, you're reacting to it, and the Quran comes down and says, it's not the way you're seeing it. This is God's perspective on it. So now, do you take your perspective or do you shift to the divine perspective? Like, do you sit with your feelings about the event or do you align your feelings with the divine want? That's the idea, right? And this happens constantly throughout the Quran, by the way. There's examples after examples of situations inside the Quran. The Sahaba are outwardly having it very difficult. Quran comes down, redefines the entire thing, right? And so now the question becomes, when we talk about having Iman in the Quran is not like, I believe it's the book of Allah. Khalas. Right? So what does it mean to believe it's the book of Allah? What's meant by having Iman in the Quran, are you prepared to sacrifice your perspective for the Quran's perspective? Are you prepared to see what you see as a loss? Are you prepared to say, no, it's a victory? What you see as pain, are you prepared to say, no, it's pleasure? Right? What you see as a loss, are you prepared to see it as a gain? Are you prepared to shift your perspective to the divine perspective? That's Iman. Iman is not, it's not like a verbal claim that I believe that is book of Allah. And so the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, the first thing you see about them, they would just change perspective. Every time the Quran came to shift their perspective, like, I mean, think about the day the Rasul is removed from Makkah al-Mukarramah. So the Prophet now, there's all the Sahaba have left. The Hijrah is taking place. They are literally being broken down, weakened, to the point of no return, right? And now the Prophet is standing there and they say that the Rasul he reaches the outskirts of Makkah al-Mukarramah and he turns back. Hadith in Bukhari, famous narration in the Seerah. The Rasul turns back and he looks towards Makkah and he says, Ya Makkah, innaki kunti ahabba al-biladi ilayya. He says, oh Makkah, you are the most beloved of lands to me. You're the most beloved city to me, right? And if it wasn't that your people were removing me, I would never leave you, right? That's the Prophet, that's the Rasul's pain. The Rasul's pain in the moments of Hijrah is that he's turning back constantly. See, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radhiyallahu anhu, he says the Prophet ﷺ, as he was making Hijrah, he kept stopping and looking back towards Mecca for a last glimmer of hope. Maybe the order will come to return, right? And so the Rasul keeps stopping and looking back. In the midst of that, what happens? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends Jibreel alayhi salam, and he says, Inna alladhi farada alayka al-Qur'ana la radduka ila ma'ad. I mean, think about it. You're being kicked out of the city that you're born in. All of your companions persecuted, sent before you, right? Some of them in Habasha. All of your properties being taken off you. In the midst of that, as you're leaving the city, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, the one that's given you the Qur'an is about to take you back to Mecca, right? In other words, you're not even leaving. You're just about to return. In the midst of, and he says it in the past tense. Inna alladhi farada alayka la radduka ila ma'ad. He's returning you right now to Mecca and he's on his way out, right? Immediate shift of perspective. It moves immediately, like, I'm not leaving, I'm actually coming back. And when he comes back, it's all glory, right? And so that's the ultimate return. And so what's meant by Iman, like, there needs to be an alignment with the Qur'an's perspective. The idea is not that we become people who embrace the Qur'an as the book of Allah, or begin to recite the Qur'an more. All of these are, like I said, blessed things. all barakah, all goodness, right? But it needs to begin with iman. That's the first thing. Second thing the scholars say, and we'll end with this, is love. The Sahaba were defined by their love for the Qur'an. Again, this is all before tajweed. It's all before maqamat. It's all before tartil. It's all before competitions in hifz, right? All of this comes first. All of those things are secondary. Right? You can be a person of the Book of Allah and not have any of that. And like we said, this is not knocking any of it because this is part of our tradition. But the idea is that we need to kind of get the coordinates right. Like prioritize things in the right order. So the first thing is iman, and what we mean by iman in the Quran is the shifting of your perspective. That you begin to see things the way the Quran wants you to see them. You acquire a Quran lens. Like you look out at the world and your Quran, you're seeing it through a verse of the Quran. The Sahaba were living the Quran entirely. Like, like it's interesting because sometimes the Sahaba would be having mundane conversations and they were quoting stories from the Quran, ayat of the Quran. And for example, they might be talking about food and they're quoting a verse of the Quran. And what that indicates is the Quran was like literally involved in every small event inside their lives. It was there. They had something they could recite. And people used to have this type of Quran literacy. Like there was an age, even if you couldn't do it in Arabic, like if you go back 30, 40, 50 years, people were able to recite verses of the Quran, the meaning of the verses, based upon different events that were happening in life, right? So difficulty comes in life. People knew the verses about, these are tests from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah will test you by losing X, Y, Z. People knew these things. It was basic literacy because people were aligned. But this had become part of the culture. It's interesting because in any culture that you go to, in a Muslim culture, like a thriving, living Muslim culture, someone dies and they all, no matter what they say in their own language, they all say, Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. That had become part of the culture. Like it's become embedded, right? That's part of the way they function as believers, right? So that's the first thing. Second thing, as we said, is love. And this is something that we miss in a very big way, right? Like once you've aligned yourself with the Quran, the bedrock, the absolute foundation of your connection with the Book of Allah, even if you don't recite it, because this will make you recite it, but the absolute foundation of your relationship, it has to be a love for the Book of Allah. So that narration that's often narrated in Tabarani, some scholars say it's a hadith, most scholars say it's an athar from the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, but they say, "Allimu awladakum thalasata khisal." Sayyidina Ali alayhi salam, he says, teach your children three qualities, right? What are the three qualities? Hubbullah, حب الرسول وحب القرآن وحب أهل بيت الرسول صلى الله عليه وسلم, right? Or كما قال. In the narration it says, teach your children three qualities: the love of the messenger, the love of his family عليهم السلام, and the love of the Quran. And what's interesting is not saying teach your children to recite the Quran, which of course follows from loving it, and he's not saying teach them to memorize the Quran. He says teach your children to love the Quran. Because if that can be, and this is something that you'll find with the Sahaba, like the Sahaba, look at Sayyidina Ikrimah ibn Abi Jahl. Ikrimah is the son of Abu Jahl, and he becomes a Muslim right at the end, after Fathu Makkah. Like he's the one who, even when Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam enters Makkah, he doesn't want to submit, and so he goes, he darts towards the Red Sea. He runs away from the army of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, and he says, "I will not convert." No acceptance. And then his wife chases him all the way to the Red Sea, right? She literally goes there and she says, look, if I bring you a guarantee from the Prophet ﷺ that you will not have trouble, will you accept the faith? Because he was just worried about being alive. And he says, I'll accept it. So he waits there at the Red Sea. And she goes and she says to the Prophet ﷺ, Ikrimah wants to convert, but the condition is that you don't harm him. Like, will he be forgiven for his crimes, for his sins? And the Rasul ﷺ says he'll be forgiven. And she says, give me a sign, Ya Rasulullah. And the Prophet ﷺ in the narration, he gives her his burda and he says, go take this to Ikrimah and show it to him and say that the Rasul is waiting for him. Like an enemy, son of Abu Jahl, right? Like definition of enemy. And so now Ikrimah comes back with the wife goes, she brings him back, he comes to the Prophet, look at what happens. Again, look at the shift, right? What is it? 15 years of animosity, right? Waging wars against the Prophet ﷺ, animosity against the Rasul ﷺ. So all of that, and then the minute he converts, the minute he receives the Quran upon the tongue of the Rasul ﷺ, what's the change? They say Ikrimah ibn Abi Jahl, in the age of Sayyidina Uthman ibn Affan, when the Quran was written down, if he ever found like a piece of paper or a piece of cloth with the Qur'an written down, he would take the piece of cloth, he would look at it and say, كلام ربي كلام ربي فغشي عليه ثم أفاق كلام ربي كلام ربي غشي عليه. They say he would pick up the written copy of the Qur'an and say, the speech of my Lord in my hands, and he would faint. He couldn't fathom that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's words can be put on paper and they can be seen by the eye. Inshallah, we're gonna end inshallah in a minute. Right? So they can be seen by the eye. So he would look at the Qur'an and he would literally just pass out. He would literally faint. And then they say he would come back around and he'd pick up the Qur'an and literally just say the same words, Kalamu Rabbi, he'd faint. Radiallahu arda, right? That was where they were at. And this is, we can mention Sahaba stories, they literally, all of the Sahaba defined by their love for the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so we have to start shifting these things. Like the coordinates of your connection with the book of Allah, they need to move. And there's inshallah other things, and we hope we get another chance inshallah, maybe this Ramadan or after, but we'll carry on with the discussion. But one of the things to think about, and practically speaking, what this means is to go back and to begin to revisit how you relate to the Qur'an. Like, don't make it about your khatam necessarily. Don't make it about how many Qur'ans you clock, right? Try and have a visceral connection, right? Try and bring it to life and just come to terms with what this is. Like, it's the speech of Allah, revealed upon the tongue of the Rasul, received upon the tongue of the Prophet ﷺ. And that's where you and I take it from the tongue of the Rasul ﷺ. And so inshallah, we ask Allah for tawfiq, we ask Allah this benefit inshallah. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we can have inshallah a permanent connection with his books. Jalla sana'u. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammad wa ala sahbihi wa sallam. Alhamdulillah rabbil alameen.